Yes, Councilman?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Oh, hello. Hello, everyone. All right, we are ready to get started. Do we have BBMR on the line?
Yes, this is Bob Senemies here on the line.
Okay, as Baltimore City Council, we are here for resolution 17-000R, which is quarterly budget briefings. We're here for fiscal year 2020, quarter 4, and fiscal 2020 closeout. I'm Eric Costello, councilman from the 11th District Committee, joined by Councilman Leon Pinkett, 7th District Vice Chair of the committee.
Thank you, Mr.
Councilwoman Danny McCray, 2nd District, member of the committee. Councilman,
Mr. Chair.
4th District, member of the committee. Council Vice President.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
6th District, member of the committee. And Councilman Isaac Itzy Schleifer, 5th District, member of the committee. Joining us on of Mayor Jack Young is Matt Stegman. And joining us on behalf of Council President Brandon Scott is Kaylin Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Bob, you are the budget director. Take it away, please.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just to note, we have a presentation we would like to share. At the moment, I'm a panelist, but it's not letting me share the presentation. So Marguerite, if you could either turn that on, or you also have a copy of it, if you could throw it up on the screen.
Try now, Mr. Sinema.
Yep, it's good now.
Uh-huh.
Thank you. Okay. So let me know when you see that, and we can go ahead and get started.
I can see it.
Okay, great. So good afternoon. My name is Bob Senemy, Budget Director for the city, and today what we're planning to share is an update on fiscal 2020 closeout. So this presentation is based on our preliminary closeout, which is data through the end of June. We've had about 3 months to go through the data and figure out where we landed in fiscal 20, which is what we'll present today. Just wanted to mention that this is unaudited data, which it is every year at this point in time. It takes a couple more months for the auditors to go through and make any corrections or changes, but we feel pretty good that this is roughly where we landed for the end of fiscal 2020. So on the first slide, what I first wanted to walk folks through was kind of the progression of what we saw from the second quarter pre-COVID to the third quarter in the early stages of COVID, and then where we ended up at the end of the year. So on this slide, if you look at the middle column, the second quarter projection, as of the end of December in fiscal 20, we were cruising along pretty well. We were projecting a $26.4 million net general fund surplus, mostly because of some revenue surpluses, especially on the income tax side. And so things looked like we were pretty safe through the end of the fiscal year. What we did when COVID hit, which was in the middle of March or so, is we revised, and what I'm calling the third quarter projection here, we revised our outlook to reflect the fact that we were expecting to lose a significant chunk of revenue through the end of the fiscal year. So at that point, we had written down our forecast and had revised our forecast to a $42.3 million net general fund deficit because, again, we assumed, and correctly in most cases, that we would have fewer revenues through the end of the year. I'm happy to report today that we ended up better than that in the fourth quarter. So what we're showing today and what we had shared a few weeks ago with the board of estimates is that we're ending with an estimated $14.3 million deficit in the general fund. That's better than what we had expected. Partly it's because of some actions that we took, which I'll get to in a moment. And it was also due to a little bit of improvement on the revenue side versus what we had first expected. So I'll walk through folks through that in a moment. But just to be very clear, so that there's no confusion, the city ended the year having spent more money than it brought in revenue, which is a very unusual situation, and which is why we keep a reserve fund, the rainy day fund, to cover situations like this. So in terms of the improvement between the third and the fourth quarter, there were three key reasons. The first two were decisions that we made, and the third was, I think, just a little bit of luck at the end of the fourth quarter. So first, we put into play right away with the mayor's support a pretty firm hiring and spending freeze. So the direction that we gave to our agencies was, if it's not COVID and if it's not absolutely essential, we shouldn't be spending it. So that applies to both spending and hiring. So we did defer some hires in the fourth quarter of fiscal 20, and those actions did successfully slow our rate of spending through the end of the fourth quarter, which helped to reduce the deficit. The second thing we did is we decided to waive planned contributions into both the rainy day fund and the OPEB trust fund. So we make budgeted contributions into both of those funds each year. The first one for the rainy day fund is so that we can build up our reserve over time. We've been making contributions for about 20 years now into the rainy day fund. We decided to waive that contribution this year because just logically, we wouldn't want to be putting money into the rainy day fund and then turning around and just pulling it out. So we decided that we just could not afford to make that contribution this year. Same is true on the OPEB trust fund. We, based on the forecast from our actuaries for retiree health benefits, we contribute money above the cost of benefits in any year to try to pre-fund costs that we'll be due in the future, and we just couldn't afford to do either of those this year. We would plan to start those up again in fiscal 22. If you remember, in the fiscal 21 budget, we cut both of those line items, and we'll see if we can afford to make those contributions in fiscal 21, depending on how that the current fiscal year ends up. And then the third item is what I'm calling June revenue, or I would say late May and into June revenue. What happened was April and May in the first quarter were pretty brutal. I mean, we saw sharp hits to our hotel tax, our convention center income, which is closed still. We saw hits to our admissions and amusement tax revenue because there were no ticketed events during that time, things like sporting events and concerts. And our parking revenues got hit pretty bad too because of COVID. What we did see is once we got into late May and into June, as we came out of like the very firm lockdown situation, we started to see slight improvement in some of that business activity, which means that some of those revenues started to recover just a little bit in June. And I'll go into more detail about that in a moment on the next slide. And included in that is that we also had a strong June for transfer and recordation taxes because of a rebound in the housing market, which I'll touch on in a moment. But these three items here are what took us from, projecting a $42.3 million deficit and getting us to the point that we still ended with a deficit, but much closer to balance than we would have without taking these actions. In terms of the revenue side of the picture, where we ended up, so this chart here shows all of our key revenue sources that ended either more than $1 million above or below budget. And, in contrast to most years when we talk about this, most of our sources, as you can see, ended up below our adopted budget. I'm going to start on the far right of this slide and talk about the ones that came in over budget, and then we'll go kind of sequentially across through to the left. So the first thing is income tax. So if you remember before COVID, our income tax was doing really well. And part of the reason for that is because of the change in the federal tax law that we've talked about a couple times in these hearings, where it was leading to people paying higher state taxes and local jurisdictions sharing in some of those receipts. So before COVID, we were doing really well to start on income tax. What we saw with COVID, at least so far, is that COVID has not yet impacted our income tax receipts. And there's a couple reasons for that. One, we believe, is that COVID did not affect our higher earners as much as it affected the lower end of the pay scale. A lot of the work that was, professional type jobs that tend to be higher paying were not as sharply affected, we don't think, because those jobs are still easier to do from a remote location. So that was one piece of it. Second piece, and probably the larger piece, is that the unemployment insurance that kicked in from both state and federal sources, kicked in to make up for lost income for those folks that were unfortunately enough, lost their jobs or were laid off or furloughed during those periods. So because those supplemental unemployment insurance benefits are taxable at the state level, we didn't see a net loss in income tax revenue. The third issue is that income tax just naturally is on a bit of a lag. So there's generally about a 1 or 2 month lag anyway in this revenue source between when it's collected by the state and turned around and distributed to the local jurisdiction. So the sum of all those three things meant that we didn't really see much of a hit on our income tax. And that was true for many jurisdictions. If you notice, the State Board of Revenue Estimates had reported that they did a little bit better than expected as well, largely because of income tax receipts. And we checked with many other jurisdictions, and almost all were seeing the same trend, that they felt like they did better than they expected on income tax, at least through the end of the fourth quarter. Going forward, income tax is an area of risk because as the federal unemployment insurance expires now and over the next few weeks, and if we don't have a deal at Congress to extend some of those benefits, we could see some more permanent losses in income tax revenue if those job losses remain permanent. Traffic cameras was the other item that came in above budget. So one of the strange but fortunate from a financial perspective benefits of COVID is that when traffic was reduced, especially during those times in the early stages in March and April when there was a hard lockdown, we actually saw more people speeding and more people getting cited for speed camera citations. So again, that was a trend that when we first saw it, we were kind of puzzled. We're like, wait, there's less people on the roads, but we have more speed camera citations. And that was something that we saw consistently, that was a trend across the country, actually, that people with less on the road, fewer people on the road, there was more of a tendency to speed and trigger those citations. In terms of the items that came in below budget, property taxes only about $1 million short of budget. What we saw with property taxes is that most people had already paid their property taxes earlier in the fiscal year because, of course, you get billed in July. And even if you're on a semi-annual payment, you'll pay your taxes, or your mortgage company will pay the taxes before December. So what we collected largely comes in the early half of the fiscal year. We did delay the tax sale, but the tax sale still went through successfully and was executed successfully. And so far, we didn't see an impact from COVID. Again, a lot of people, between the stimulus checks that many people got and the unemployment insurance, it will look like, at least in the short term, that protected us from seeing any misses on property tax income. Transfer and recordation taxes finished $1.5 million below budget, and this one was a kind of a wild ride. And for those of you who have been watching these presentations, over the last couple of years, that we almost over the last decade, we've had some and sometimes significant surpluses in this revenue source. This year was the first year in at least it looks like about a decade that we ended up actually below budget. And what happened here is that in the early stages of COVID, we basically lost like a whole month of activity in April. In the early stages of COVID, as people were reacting to figure out, whether it was safe to be together, to show houses, the activity in the market dropped off significantly. Once we got past that first phase, the activity picked up significantly in May and June. So the good news is that coming out of the end of fiscal 20 and into fiscal 21, the market is actually pretty hot. There's been some news about this. If you go look in the Baltimore Sun, there was a good article yesterday about the improvements in the housing market. And so what we saw is at the end of May and June, and so far, at least into fiscal 21, we've seen more activity. There's a couple of reasons for that. The most obvious one is that interest rates are at truly historic lows. And we've said before in these hearings that interest rates are low, but now they are truly at the lowest rates they've been in decades. 30-year mortgage for somebody with reasonably good credit can get quoted at something even under 3%. The other factor that we think is happening is that there is a push for people that have work at home requirements or schooling at home, that they're looking for more space. So we have discussed this with our partners in city agencies, agencies like Housing and Community Development, Live Baltimore, who works very closely with the realtor community to figure out what's going on. And both of those parties have said, yes, there seems to be kind of a national trend where people are looking to upgrade space since they know they'll be working from home for potentially a longer period of time. So there is some kind of good upward pressure on the market. And that enabled us to kind of have a strong May and June. But even with that strong May and June, we still ended up a little bit, $1.5 million below budget for that source. The next one, earnings on investments, $1.9 million below budget. This is the earnings that the city earns on its cash balances. So the opposite effect here is that with lower interest rates, it allows consumers to borrow more, but it also means lenders, which in this case, the city is a lender for some of its short-term cash balances. We just earned much fewer interest earnings on those cash balances because interest rates are so low. The next three on here, emissions and amusement, convention center, and net hotel tax, that all has to do with what I had mentioned earlier, is there was less business activity and tourist activity in the city. Fewer ticketed events. The convention center was closed in the fourth quarter, is still closed to activity. And hotel tax, like I mentioned, we had fewer visitors and we had very minimal occupancy. We did see in June that we had some hotels were reporting 10 to 15% occupancy, but in a normal year, we would be seeing hotels reporting 60, 65% and up for hotel rooms in the spring and into the summer. So we were nowhere near that because of COVID. And then parking revenues also plays into that effect with less people visiting the city, fewer parking revenues. We also made a policy decision to not enforce certain meters, which led to fewer citations being issued in the early stages of COVID. And so that also led to a reduction in our parking revenues. All other is a whole bunch of other things, tax credits, ECB fines, for example, and a whole bunch of other smaller revenue sources combined came in below budget. And then highway user revenue was below budget. Our projection is $22.6 million. And again, that was because less driving activity. This is a state source of funds that's shared with local jurisdictions. And because the state was experiencing a similar slowdown in driving and travel activity, that ended up impacting the city. We did get a late payment from HUR that came in kind of after the bell, so to speak, for fiscal 20. We're working with our auditors now to see if we can count that in fiscal 20 or if we have to defer that into fiscal 21. So the 22.6 is the really bad estimate, but we did get a little bit of extra revenue at the end of June. We're just not sure if we can count it for June or into fiscal 21. So on the expenditure side of the budget, flipping to, so before we get to the expenditure side, this for your reference is everything I just discussed, just in kind of a table form, showing what the budget was, what the final closeout revenue estimate was, and then how that compared versus budget. And again, like you see, a lot of red ink here because of COVID for the first time in many years. Only two of our key income sources came in above budget. On the spending side of the budget, like I said, we had a spending freeze that limited our normal baseline expenditures, but we also had additional COVID response expenses. And so as of the end of fiscal 20, we estimate that we've spent about $32 million of COVID-related general fund expenses. And you can see in this pie chart here what that was spent on, things like food distribution, the housing and the sheltering for vulnerable populations. We had some investment, the green pieces, some investments to set up telework capacity for our employees. We had the small business assistance program, the health department, of course, providing medical care and all of the response that they're doing to COVID, and of course the protective equipment that we purchased. Other is everything else. The biggest item in there is the hazard pay that we're providing for our frontline level employees. So the total of that was about $32.6 million of expenses. And our strategy so far is that I'll show you in a moment, we had to dip into our rainy day fund to balance this year's budget, but because of some of these expenses, we do think we can charge some of these to our CARES allocation, and we think we will be reimbursed for some of them via FEMA as well. In terms of the actions we took to close out fiscal 20, the Board of Estimates about, I guess it was 3 weeks ago now, approved a drawdown of up to $25 million to end the fiscal year in balance. We will likely not need all the $25 million. We gave ourselves a little bit of wiggle room in case there were any audit adjustments, unanticipated adjustments that come through as we go through the audit. The charter is very clear that the city must end each year with the general fund in balance, and the rainy day fund is there so that if we have a situation like this that's just out of our control, that we can dip into that to close the budget in balance at the end of the fiscal year. The rainy day fund can also only be used per policy after all reasonable efforts have been made in controlling expenses, and we think we did that with the hiring freeze we put into place and the waiver of some of those contributions into our reserve funds. We feel like we took every action to minimize expenses, so we feel like we met the letter and the intent of the law. The council acted on 5 agency actions to close and balance. So these agencies that I listed here, police, fire, health, DGS, and HCD, BDC, are the agencies that were most directly affected by COVID, that had response costs that hit their budgets that they weren't able to absorb. And so the council did act on those items within I guess it was 2 weeks ago, acted on those items, which is what was required to bring agency appropriation into balance. I would just say, going ahead in closing, fiscal 20 was just a brutal year with COVID. So we're happy to put that in the rearview mirror, of course. So far in fiscal 21, we'll be coming back, soon to talk about first quarter projections. Our staff is working on those projections now. What we know so far in fiscal 21 is that we do have this federal aid that is helping us to pay for some of these response costs, but the lion's share of it does expire at the end of December. So that's a risk. And then on the income tax side, like I mentioned earlier, we are concerned that as the either state and or federal aid expires directly to households and to individuals, that there could be some permanent loss of income tax revenue. So we're monitoring that very closely. The good news so far has been really the transfer and recordation, the housing market, where the transactions are up. Both the number of transactions and the prices are up so far in the first quarter. So that's just a little preview of what we're seeing so far in fiscal 21, but we'll of course be coming back to the committee sometime over the next couple months to report in more detail on fiscal 21. So I can pause there and happy to take any questions from the committee at this point.
Thank you. Marguerite or Bob, can you take the presentation down, please?
Sure.
Bob, what do we have left in our rainy day fund?
So this year, so we have a balance going into closeout of $145 million. We asked for permission up to $25 million. And like I said, we might not need all of it, but if we were to use the full 25 that we have the authority, that would take us down to about $120 million balance in the fund. And, it sounds like a lot of money, but $120 million is only about 6% of our operating budget. Our target, that's less than 1 month worth of operating expenses. So, the best practice is generally that you have the equivalent of 1 month worth of operating expenses, or even a little bit more in reserve to handle an emergency like this. So with this withdrawal, if we do have to withdraw that full amount, we'd be down to only about 6.5% of our operating budget in terms of the fund size. And, for fiscal 21, still a lot of risk out there. Of course, if we have to go into kind of a full shutdown mode again, I think we would see a similar slowdown in revenues like we saw at the end of fiscal 20. So we're hopeful that we can get this, under control and keep, business activity at least at a pace that allows us to get through the end of fiscal 21.
So we were at 104 at closeout, correct?
145.
145 at closeout. So worst case scenario, we'd be at 120.
Right.
When will a determination be made on what the expenditure is going to be?
So it will take likely through the end of this calendar year because we're just waiting for the audit at this point. And what a lot of the audit what it captures is there's some judgment that can be used on whether you count revenue versus fiscal 20 or fiscal 21. So we make an estimate of what we think should have counted versus fiscal 20. But sometimes the auditors will disagree and say, hey, you counted something in 20 that should have been in 21 or vice versa. So usually there's some adjustments. They're usually not much, but there can be some adjustments on either side that could make the picture a little bit better, a little bit worse. But we feel pretty confident at this point that it's going to be a $14.3 million deficit or better, just based on the data we've seen even since we put that presentation together.
And if we don't expend all that 25, the balance just remains in the rainy day fund, correct?
Right. That's right. It would just remain in the fund.
And what is the specific percentage that best practices tell us we should have in the rainy day fund at any given time?
Yeah, our policy says 8%. Best practice is generally 8% or more. Some jurisdictions go a little bit higher than that, but our research has shown that you should have at least 8% because that's the equivalent of like 1 month of operating expenditures. In a situation like COVID, we had one small subset of our revenue stream get just crushed for a quarter of the fiscal year. So I think this is a good example of why we need a rainy day fund. If this would have happened earlier in the fiscal year, say September, November, we would have had to run out potentially 6 or 8 months or even more worth of lower expenditures, which is why you need a fund to cover that. So we were actually lucky in regard that it happened later in the fiscal year. If this happened early in the fiscal year, we could have been in more trouble and might have had to make more either mid-year reductions or dip in even further into our rainy day fund.
So, and remind me again, what was the allocation that we planned to make in the fiscal 21 budget to the rainy day fund?
So it was $8 million and we cut it in half to $4 million. And so if we do draw down money from the rainy day fund, the board does require us to repay that over the next 5 years. So we cut the contribution, but we left enough to make the first repayment installment in fiscal 21. But we will only make that payment, that repayment, if we feel comfortable that we get through fiscal 21, whole, which is we're still a long way away from that.
So does the guidance just so let's say we end up spending 16 million. No, let's call it 20 million just for the sake of conversation.
Sure.
If we spend 20 million, our guidance says that we need to allocate an additional 20 million over at some point during the next 5 years. It doesn't say that we have to do 4 million each year, correct?
All right, I think I just lost you for a second. Can you, would you mind repeating that last point?
Yeah, no problem. If we expend 20 million, our guidance says that we have to allocate an additional 20 million at some point over the next 5 years. It doesn't necessarily say we need to allocate 4 million over each of the next 5 years to come to a grand total of 20 million, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So you have to pay it back within 5 years. It's the law or the policy is silent on how quickly you do it. I can tell you, if we're to get reimbursed through FEMA, we would, use some of it to reimburse whatever we've done to kind of take care of the policy. And then we could take the contribution in the operating budget down to save us going into the next year. But yeah, it's silent on how we do that. It just defers to finance on the best way to handle that.
And is the policy silent on whether or not we are supplementing or supplanting what our what our regular contribution would be, save for the fact that there's this emergency situation?
Yeah, it is silent on that. It says the target level that the city should be aiming to get to a target level of 8%. We've never actually reached 8%. We've been contributing over many years, over a decade now, to try to get to that level. And before COVID, we were close. We were at about 7.4% or 7.5% of the operating budget. So, but it doesn't say, it's not specific about repayment versus continuing on the trend to the 8%.
Okay, that's helpful. And one other question around CARES Act reimbursement. I know that there's been some discussion about the feasibility of using or of utilizing. Let me take a step back. There has been discussion around providing bonuses, one-time bonuses, to a certain segment of our employee workforce in the city. And it has been suggested that we can afford to pay for that because we would be reimbursed from the CARES Act. My understanding from scouring through Department of Treasury guidance is that a one-time bonus or a bonus in general, is not permitted to be reimbursed through CARES Act funds. Is that correct?
That's correct. So the CARES Act guidance, it says that hazard pay is eligible, and we are providing hazard pay, which is an additional amount each pay period for our frontline employees. It does say that bonuses are prohibited. When this issue came up, there was an internal conversation about, could we justify doing a one-time payment and calling it hazard pay? To be safe, we ran that by our economic recovery consultants that are helping us interpret the CARES Act. It's Ernst & Young we have on contract that's helping us with that. And their guidance to us was, it's your judgment, but in our judgment, they said, if it looks like a bonus and it smells like a bonus, it is a bonus and it will be interpreted as a one-time bonus. So they advise that we don't do anything on a one-time basis. But the hazard pay that we're providing in Paychecks Now on a recurring basis is eligible.
Right. I usually use the analogy, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, but
yeah, that's what I was.
And I think I clearly understand what you're saying. So there should be no confusion about it, that utilizing CARES Act funds to cover the cost of bonuses or anything perceived at bonuses, according to our consultant that does for a living, among other things, interpreting the CARES Act and CARES Act guidance, that would be out of bounds.
Yes, that was their recommendation. They didn't feel comfortable.
No, I appreciate that clarification. Colleagues, Henry?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for raising this issue, because this is one that a number of people have had questions about, and I appreciate Mr. Senemy giving us some additional guidance on this. One of the questions that it raises for me is the definition of hazard pay. Is there a requirement that hazard pay be a specific amount?
No.
So is there anything that would stop us from determining that, given not only the dangers of the pandemic itself, but the additional dangers to the workers from the additional work? We have testimony from the acting director of DPW that their tonnage collected is up significantly and has been since the lockdown started, which, especially during the summer months when it was hot, caused workers to be out there lifting more trash every day and basically putting themselves more at risk from exhaustion. And so the reason I'm asking it in this fashion is, if the city decided that it wanted to increase the hazard pay by a certain amount, whatever the Board of Estimates thought was reasonable. My question is, would the CARES Act let us pay that increased hazard pay retroactively to the beginning of the state of emergency and do the additional hazard pay retroactively in a lump sum?
So, to answer your question, the guidance has definitely been don't do a lump sum because it looks like a bonus, which I explained earlier. In terms of is there limits in the law? There's no limits in the law. The limit is in our allocation, of course. So we got $103 million.
Sure.
We've already spent. We feel that the hazard pay we're providing is pretty generous. It's it's of the tune of $200 for some frontline employees per pay period, which works out to a pretty significant increase. We did extend the hazard pay through the end of December, so that just went to the board. So for those people that are on the front lines and they're at risk, it's really turning out to be like a 9-month period where they're getting additional pay. The real challenge is it's not in the law, but it's just the allocation we have that we're running out because we've spent some of the money, we've allocated most of the money already. And then when it's done in December, we go back to having to live on our own, unless there's another bill that comes forward, which, we, like I've shared with everybody, we're hopeful that there will be another stimulus bill with some help to local governments. But at this point, it doesn't look likely, especially before the election. So.
Well, okay. So the first question I'd have back for that is, I certainly understand that if you pay a lump sum proactively, how that could be easily described as a bonus, and I understand the suggestion to avoid it. I'm still a little less clear on the idea that if we determined that the hazard pay should have been higher all along, just hypothetically, if we decided it should have been 225 or 250 or whatever, is there really if we determine it should have been that, would the issue be that paying the retroactive hazard pay in one lump sum would be treated as a bonus, or as opposed to if we determined that since it should have been 225 all along, but since we can't go back and do that retroactively because it'll look like a bonus, instead we should make it 275 for the rest of the calendar year until the CARES Act money comes out, that wouldn't be treated as a bonus.
Yeah, I mean the guidance is pretty vague on this. The only thing it says is hazard pay is okay, bonuses are not. So the guidance we got was you got to be really, really ultra careful about doing a bonus. I mean, the consultants don't tell us you have to do it or not. They're just saying we very strongly suggest based on their reading of the guidance. It's ultimately the city's decision, but I agree with their judgment that if it says bonus, you can't do that. You've got to be careful about doing that, even in the form that you talk about. But even beyond that, I think the limitation, I want to remind folks of that allocation for CARES. A portion of it is being used as a match for us to apply for the FEMA dollars. So if you remember, FEMA generally reimburses 75% of eligible costs. They're letting local jurisdictions use CARES as the 25%. So we've already used a chunk of about 20 or so million for that. Other things that you've heard about in the news, the small business relief program, contact tracing, is all paid for by CARES. There's we have to make that we're using CARES money. We also have to leave some money for CARES to pay for costs that are not reimbursable through FEMA. So there are some holes in the FEMA rules. Like for example, one thing is that we talked actually today with a consultant is the FEMA rules say you're not allowed to pay, even though we're setting up sheltering, they won't pay for unoccupied hotel rooms. So we're renting out the Lord Baltimore Hotel, but not every room is occupied the entire time. And they've said, you might not get reimbursed for those unoccupied rooms, but you get reimbursed for the ones that aren't occupied. That's still a cost to the city. So I give those examples just to say that hazard pay is by no means the only thing that we're spending out of the CARES Act. There's a whole host of other very important things that we felt like we had to allocate money towards. That's using up most of that money. So even if the law was more generous, we still were probably just be close to being out of money and couldn't do anything more. It expired in December.
So, Mr. Chair, thank you for this. I will make one final observation that our colleagues, Councilman Schleifer and Councilman Cohen, have suggested a $5,000 bonus for each of the sanitation workers. And I understand and I appreciate Mr. Seneme's and your clarification on why a bonus may not be reimbursable or would not be reimbursable through the CARES Act funding. However, the two things I would note are that even if we were to provide each sanitation worker with $5,000 in extra compensation to make up for the extra work that they've been doing now for several months, that would only be my understanding is that it would only be a little over $1 million out of $103 million CARES Act allocation. And I know that a number of different very good uses have already been listed. I would just want to make certain that we were open with the public about the fact that while we are spending CARES Act funds on a number of very important things, that there's no reason we should not have this conversation about whether or not fairly compensating our sanitation workers is one more important thing that we have to figure out how we fund. And given that the number I remember from DPW was that their tonnage was up 30% over the lockdown. I know that most people would not enjoy having their job suddenly have 30% more work every week. And the idea that we would not be willing to at least look for ways to fairly compensate people for having had such an incredible increase in their work, during their work week. I hope we continue to look for appropriate and legal ways to properly compensate some of our essential workers. And that's all. Mr. Chair, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Councilman. And I am more than happy to continue to have that conversation. My concern is that we should not be putting out there that there is a false hope that this is going to happen because we can just tap into the CARES Act and get a $5,000 arbitrarily selected bonus for one subset of our workforce. I don't know any member of this council who disagrees with how challenging and how dangerous the job is of our folks in the solid waste division and how much that job has gotten even more exponentially more difficult since the pandemic. There's no question about that. But the issue here for me is when we are suggesting that this is a way to do it, I believe that is disingenuous because what has been laid out as the proposal for the $5,000 bonus is not a legal way to do that. And as every member of this body knows, we unfortunately have had or had to live through or suffer through our fair share of other elected officials doing things that are either illegal or unethical. So I have a very fundamental issue with proposing to do something that is not consistent with the law. And, Councilman, I believe you'll recall maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and I think Mr. Seneme can fill us in on this, weren't we on the hook to the federal government for about $1.7 million for funding that we were supposed to expend related to housing individuals that were experiencing homelessness? and we were inconsistent with guidance that the federal government required us to follow. And as a result, we had to pay the federal government back.
We did. I can't remember what year. It goes back many years, but we have had instances where if we cannot, document spending federal grant money being spent correctly, we did have to turn around and reimburse out of the general fund, which of course we don't want to do.
I appreciate that. And I don't want to see the city, I believe we have a responsibility as fiscal stewards for the city. Wouldn't want to see the city be put in that position or put under public pressure to do something like that. But Councilman, I appreciate your comments, and would welcome the opportunity to have that conversation and to figure out creative ways that are consistent with federal law and federal guidance on how to properly compensate our folks who are clearly undercompensated and frankly deserve more. They deserve better. So, Councilman Henry, do you have any other? I'm going to jump to Council Vice President Middleton, unless Councilman Henry, did you have any other questions?
No, thank you very much. And actually, I'm going to go dark because I'm going to be doing another call at the same time and bouncing back and forth. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Council Vice President Middleton.
Yes. And of course, a shout out to our continued first responders in every agency that are helping during COVID. So my question, there was a slide you had up, and I know of, I guess, the agencies that had been spending that extra money for COVID. And I noticed that the fire department was like tripled. I think it was 11 million, which had been spending the most of all agencies. Can you give some, I guess, just a brief summary of why they are spending so much more than others?
Sure. So OEM falls under the fire department. So what happened there was, fire did have some direct expenses, both on response and, especially with the EMS side of the agency, with responses to be able to do that safely. They did have a lot of the PPE expenses, the cleaning expenses, the overtime, the response. But what happened there is because OEM is part of the fire department, there are also some kind of general, more citywide expenses that we did that ended up getting charged to fire. Things like the PPE and things that OEM was coordinating for the city as a whole. So that's why that one was higher. We do think a lot of that stuff will be reimbursed for, but that's why fire was higher in that regard.
Okay, that's my only question. Thank you.
Colleagues? Vice Chair Pinkett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just had two quick questions. And one, Bob, you probably have to get back to me. Of the $32.6 million of COVID expenses, do we have a breakdown on how much of that was spent locally and then how much of it was spent with minority businesses or MBAs?
So I would have to get back to you. I know there was, that we did a response on this at a hearing a couple months ago about our spending so far and the types of businesses. So I'll have to go back and look at that response. I know procurement had looked at that. I don't know offhand.
Okay. Yeah, if you can get that for me. And then my second question was, and this is kind of a little bit early, but just I figure we should be thinking about it, being that we depend so much on tourism. Are we anticipating what level of investment we will have to make in that particular industry to kind of reinvigorate it, to get it restarted? I would imagine that we're going to have to put some money there in order to change, Baltimore's profile.
Yeah. So when I was going through some of the spend from CARES earlier with Councilman Henry, one thing that I didn't mention is there is an allocation of money going to both Visit Baltimore and the Convention Center for Visit Baltimore to try to kind of reboot, so to speak, on the market to make folks feel comfortable that they can come visit here safely. So we're working with them on a plan. There's also some money in the CARES that we're allocating to the Convention Center, with the idea being to put in some air filtering systems to make the space safer. And what we heard from convention center is that the demand for tourists now, or for people coming to conventions, is they don't want to be in a building where the air we did make, it was about 7 million total between Visit Baltimore. I'm sorry, 7 million total between Visit Baltimore and the convention center out of CARES as kind of a start on reinvesting in the market. But once that money, once that money dries up, we're back on our own, which is why I think additional federal investments would be so helpful for a city like Baltimore that has the challenges we do to start with, to try to restart that side of the market. But we have been working with both, Convention Center and Visit Baltimore on this because it is an issue.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sure.
Thank you, Councilman. Any other colleagues? Okay, Bob, thanks for the excellent work.
Sure. Thank you.
I'd like to follow up with a Budget and Appropriations Committee hearing sometime in the next 4 to 6 week range, just to go through what we've done related to COVID, just with a focus on COVID. So we can talk, maybe, sometime next week and just talk about the scope of that.
Okay.
The council's been really briefed on that as a whole, so this would probably be the appropriate forum for that. All right, we are now in recess.